In the early 1960s, the Vietnam War felt distant to many Americans. It was a conflict happening thousands of miles away, described on evening news broadcasts with maps, arrows, and official statements promising progress. But by the end of the decade, the war had crossed oceans and entered American homes, campuses, streets, and living rooms. It did not arrive with bombs, but with fear, anger, and division. The Vietnam War did not just fracture Vietnam, it turned America against itself. At the heart of the domestic conflict was a generation of young Americans who were being asked to fight and die for reasons that grew increasingly unclear. Between 1964 and 1973, more than 2.7 million U.S. soldiers served in Vietnam. The average age of a combat soldier was just 19. Many were drafted straight out of high school or college. By 1968 alone, over 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, and American casualties were rising rapidly. That year became the deadliest of the war, with more than 16,000 American soldiers killed. College campuses became the epicenter of resistance. Students questioned why they were being sent to fight a war that Congress had never formally declared. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964, based on disputed reports of attacks on U.S. ships, gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate the war without a declaration. As troop numbers surged, so did student protests. By 1967, demonstrations were taking place at more than 200 universities. The Students for a Democratic Society grew from a small activist group into a national movement with tens of thousands of members. The draft intensified the anger. Nearly 1.9 million men were drafted during the Vietnam War, while working class and minority youth were disproportionately sent to fight. Wealthier Americans often found ways to avoid service through college deferments or medical exemptions. This inequality fueled resentment and deepened class divisions. In some cities, draft cards were burned publicly. In others, young men fled to Canada. An estimated 30,000 to 40,000 Americans left the country to avoid the draft. As protests grew larger, the government responded with force. In October 1967, over 100,000 demonstrators gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest the war. Thousands were arrested. Surveillance programs monitored activists, students, and civil rights leaders. The FBI's COINTELPRO program targeted anti-war groups, viewing dissent as a threat to national security. Trust between citizens and the government continued to erode. Television played a powerful and unprecedented role. For the first time in American history, war was broadcast nightly into people's homes. By 1968, nearly 93% of American households owned a television. Viewers saw wounded soldiers, burning villages, and body counts that contradicted official optimism. The government claimed progress, but images told a different story. The Tet Offensive of 1968, a massive coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shocked the nation. Although U.S. forces eventually repelled the offensive, it exposed the falsehood of claims that the war was nearing victory. Public opinion shifted dramatically. In 1965, only about 25% of Americans believed sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake. By 1971, that number had risen to nearly 60%. Confidence in leadership collapsed further with the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. These classified documents revealed that multiple administrations had misled the public about the war's progress and intentions. The credibility gap became a defining phrase of the era. The conflict spilled into the streets. In 1968, protests following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. led to riots in more than 100 cities. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that same year turned violent as police clashed with anti-war demonstrators, an event witnessed live on television by millions. In 1970, the nation was shaken when National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 unarmed students and wounding 9. Within days, more than 4 million students went on strike nationwide, shutting down hundreds of colleges. Families were divided too. Dinner tables became battlegrounds of opinion. Veterans returning from Vietnam often faced hostility rather than honor. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was poorly understood and rarely treated. By the end of the war, over 58,000 Americans had been killed, and more than 300,000 wounded. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Media manipulation and political messaging continued, even as opposition mounted. The Nixon administration promoted Vietnamization, claiming U.S. forces were withdrawing while secretly expanding bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. Between 1969 and 1973, more than 2.7 million tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia. Much of it without public knowledge. When these operations became public, outrage intensified protests and distrust. By the time the last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam in 1973, America was exhausted and deeply fractured. The war had reshaped attitudes toward authority, patriotism, and protest. Faith in government reached historic lows, and skepticism toward official narratives became ingrained in American culture. 2 years later, when Saigon fell in 1975, it marked not just the end of a war abroad, but the conclusion of one of the most turbulent internal conflicts in U.S. history. The Vietnam War at home revealed how fragile national unity could be when truth was distorted. Power went unchecked, and young lives were treated as expendable. The echoes of that era remain visible today in debates over protests, media trust, and political division. The war taught America that the most dangerous battles are sometimes not fought overseas, but within a nation's own conscience.